How's it going? It's Paul Moffat here from Velosophy, and I'm with my guest, as always, Asaf from Drkhorse Training. Asaf is a PhD student, and I'm a awesome cycling coach, my coach, as a matter of fact. And I am a personal trainer and cycling coach. I have my degree in sports and exercise science. Um, Comparing ourselves. Asaf is like a Cat 1-2 racer when we're talking about education, and I'm probably a Cat 4, Cat 3, stumbling my way through, but enjoying having fun at the same time in terms of where my education is at. Asaf, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. So I'm excited to do. This is our third episode.
Yeah.
It's been super fun.
Yeah,
So,
we've been getting some good responses, and just a little shout out to a few people. I saw Juliet yesterday, and
oh, I saw it
she's
today.
saying she's really
Yeah.
enjoying it on the way out to some epic gravel adventure as always, and also through Instagram we had a guy called Trevor. I think he's from Abbotsford or Chilliwack way, and he was saying he's really enjoying it, and he suffered some shoulder issues and a couple other health issues, and he was
Mm.
enjoying watching our episodes while he heals up and does some indoor training. So shout out to you, Trevor. I hope you have a speedy recovery and enjoy the banter we have for you today. So
Yeah.
Asaf has been enticing us with this topic of coasting that I'm super interested in for a few weeks now, and we're finally going to just open that up right off the start. I guess we segued into that by our previous topics on zone 1 heart rate training. So if you're not sure what that is, go back to last episode where we kind of define what that means for us and how we use that. And yeah, so what have you got for us today?
Yes. Maybe right before we jump into coasting, and I will go to coasting. Not gonna forget this time. Uh, our mutual friend Neil Brown, who's now out east, he asked about if we can actually upload this podcast onto a platform that's sound only.
Yes.
I don't know if you got a chance to look at that, but maybe that's something we need to look at for our listeners. So,
Yeah, so if
uh,
you're listening to this, you have to remember that we're fumbling through this. The arena of social media and even being online is kind of not our forte. So definitely looking at that option, and we will be doing that in the next few weeks. We'll have all these episodes up on audio only, so you guys can listen to it while you're doing outdoor rides or taking your dog for a walk. So yeah.
yes. Okay, good. Okay, so coasting. The topic came about because we wanted to. I think we noted something about trainer rides versus outdoor rides.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's really a case where coasting really comes into play. When you're riding on the trainer, there's little coasting. Okay, maybe if you take a small break or something like that, that's probably the only time that you stop pedaling versus riding outside. When we ride outside, the time we coast or not pedal and still moving it is quite extensive. It definitely has a significant impact. And a lot of times when I look at riders, we can call it training efficiency, you find that in many cases they do plug in the hours, but they don't really push themselves as much as either the workout requires or perhaps get the right adaptations. So coasting is something that people should definitely be aware of. When I did my base training years ago, that was one thing that we always tried to account for. So when you do base training, for example, at zone 1, we wanted to try and do it in flatter areas, maybe areas that don't have too many hills so that you're not always power on and power off, and you're trying to remain as consistent as possible. If you can't do that and your area is very hilly, what you may want to consider is maybe trying to stay on the gas, keep on pedaling when you're going downhill. Again, being safe, and obviously, if you're in an urban environment, just be cautious. But still, if you have a workout that's an hour long, and out of that workout, you spend a lot of time I don't know exactly, well, I don't want to give a specific number, 15% of this or 20% of that. But in general, if you find yourself just coasting along on a long descent, you're kind of losing a lot of that ride time quality. So it's something definitely to bear in mind. We look at coasting and the physiology of coasting a little bit in my studies. We have even a laboratory session that we conduct to the public in my laboratory in Vancouver, where we ask individuals to ride a step test, do an incremental step test, where they start from a very low intensity, and then they have 5-minute steps with 1 minute breaks in between, and then it goes up and 5 minutes again, 1 minute recovery, and then so on and so forth until they can't go any further. Now, the thing about those 1 minute is we want to look at the recovery that occurs during that time. That recovery is quite significant. So for that specific test, we found that yes, coasting is representative of something quite meaningful in the quality of the workout.
Right.
So if you do a test like that versus a test that doesn't have coasting, the final outcome can be quite different. So definitely, and by final outcome, I mean how hard you can actually go.
Mm.
So there are cases where coasting is important, but it's more about structured workouts that are high intensity, and you want to include that recovery. But when we're talking about the majority of your training that are zone 1, long volume, you may want to consider eliminating that coasting and
Yeah.
trying to stay on top of the gas.
I like to, when I'm thinking about that, I think about what's the highest yield I can get for that workout, right? And indoors, that's why indoors is so valuable, is you get a really high yield. There's no traffic interruptions, no stop streets, no traffic lights, etc. There's no opportunities to unclip or uncoast per se, or coast. So, or if you do coast, it's very obvious, and it's very distinct drop in power in your profile, whether you're using Strava or Training Peaks. But most of us ride outside. So how can you get good value from that? And I've got 2 workouts I do with my athletes, which are very similar but have different results. And listening to athletes' comments, they feel completely different. So the theory is coming from what they're training for, their events. Now, often in events, it's kind of funny because it's the one time that athletes during their whole season of training actually ride for 4+ hours nonstop, not taking any breaks if they can. And for the first time, pedaling almost the entire 4 hours, because for once we have traffic control people and shut down lights and highways like what's the Grand Fondo is just straight line, right? There's not even really any cornering, so there's hardly any excuses for coasting. So that's kind of like the first step I take with a new athlete is like, can you just ride for 4 hours without stopping, without coasting? And that is extremely fatiguing for them. So I think of it as like a pedal conditioning exercise, like something that often is overlooked that can be quite valuable to them in the long run. I'm trying to take care of that first before we start to do any high intensity training. So the 2 workouts that I have is kind of like the Richmond loop, the standard one that everybody does, because it's kind of fun in the off season just to build up some distance, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at that data, and I look at 3 fields. I look at heart rate, obviously, because I want to see how close to their zone 1 they are, their cadence, and then their power as well. I just want to see kind of like, is there any spikes as they're going around corners or as they're leaving lights, anything that's unnecessary power output. And what I see is a lot of data that intersects each other's fields. And when you get comments from riders, they say that it's not a super fatiguing ride because there's this inherent coasting and taking breaks where they might not realize it. Now, take the same distance, the same duration, and the same intensity, trying to keep everything at zone 1, and we do more of a TT based workout where we do Iona out and back, where we know there's no interruptions. followed by River Road out and back where there's no interruptions, and then a little TT loop that I stole off of Declan and Patty and the boys from earlier this year, from the number 7, number 6 highway, where I know that there's very little interruptions. And what we see is suddenly the data fields, when done well, are completely separated. So I'll do a little share screen. I'll actually show you one that I did myself. So it's from a workout that you were giving me last year, slow cadence strength drills. And so let's go training peaks here. So this is actually my training peaks. So it feels weird sharing this with you, Asaf, because I feel like I'm about to be judged here, but that's okay. So this is kind of like the high yield here, where you can see like the data fields are completely separated, and they only crisscross when I turn around. Whereas we compare like the commute over here, the data channels have a lot of crisscrossing, cadence stops, and then up and down. And sometimes you'll see the power curve crisscrossing that, and doesn't necessarily say anything particularly important, but it's interesting to note the difference between the clear data fields here and here. And what I found is if you do rides that resemble this, and there's a third one here, that's the TT that I was talking about on the way back. Oh, actually, I didn't mention this one. This is on the way back on Southwest Marine Drive. It's more fatiguing, even though the parameters are all the same. So comments from athletes are like, wow, that was a much more tiring workout, even though most of the stress scores are the same, because they didn't get those breaks in there that they usually do. So for me, that's like a nice high yield workout to do. So
yeah, well, that's a great example. I think you covered that really, really, really well. I'm going to take the other angle, and I'm going to maybe indicate when pedaling consistently for a long period of time isn't very good.
Yeah.
So when you do a trainer workout, which is something that was very relevant not too long ago, I think a lot of times I have cases where I have to give riders alternatives, right? So if the weather isn't good, and all of a sudden they have to ride indoors, and let's say on the schedule they had a 4-hour volume ride, now they ask me, oh, should I do the same thing but on the trainer?
Right.
And the answer to that isn't it's not as simple as saying, yeah, just do 4 hours on the trainer, because you have to account for those coasting effects. And if you go on the trainer and do 4 hours, even if it's the same power output as it is outside, you just show that when you're constantly pedaling, the cost of that is much higher. Mm-hmm. So the question is, okay, which one is better? So let me tell you, that's a lot more complicated than just saying, well, on the trainer you pedal more, so obviously that's more efficient as a workout, or riding outside simulates what I'm actually going to do, so that's more efficient. Mm-hmm. From recent data that we've collected, we haven't published it yet, riding indoors on the trainer, on a fixed trainer, maybe the ones that rock back and forth, or the rollers or something like that, is slightly different, but the fixed trainers that you use at home versus riding in the field is very different. Extremely different. Now that may not sound like something that's new to a lot of riders that have this experience of moving back and forth from indoor to out, but to see the data and how you recruit your muscles and how they behave inside versus out, we didn't expect it to be that different. So hopefully I'll be able to share more once we are at the stage of publication, but that's just a bit of a taste on what we're doing. But I think that's really highlighting the point that you have to be cautious when you're saying, okay, I'm just going to mimic that workout inside, because you're not training the same thing. And that cost Before we started this podcast, we talked about how tired you still are from your 300-kilometer ride.
Yeah.
You know, those, the price you pay on a ride that you think is good for you, but actually it's much more difficult than the coach planned for you or you planned for yourself going into it, can really hit you hard for quite an extensive period of time after the workout is done.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to be careful when you just jump on a trainer or jump straight into just, okay, I'm not going to stop pedaling at all for the workout I'm given. Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's funny. And for anyone who's listening and looking for clear black and white answers, right and wrong, you're not going to find that here on our channel. Our job is to share the science, share our anecdotes, and help you to make up your own mind as to what's right for you. As we talked about last week, all the science can be saying one thing, and your athlete makes comments about how they feel, and that's more important, and will direct the training and customize it to what's going on in their body, because it might not always be reflected that well in Training Peaks. It doesn't count for everything. The science isn't perfect for every individual. There has to be some room for customization for athletes. And another thing that just popped into my mind, as you were saying, like sometimes coasting or not coasting isn't everything. So when I'm training someone and I'm trying to help them understand that at the beginning and try to simulate what they're going to expect from their events, another thing to consider is the event itself. And if we're talking about a race or an event that you want to do really well, there's a lot of shared knowledge or research showing that the top players tend to coast more often than not. So all the training teaches you how to be stronger and how to use your pedal stroke more efficiently. But when you're racing, you want to conserve that as much as possible, right? It totally makes sense. If you're coasting more of the time in a race, you're preserving your zone one stores, you're preserving your glycogen, you're preserving everything. So finding the best spot where you can be in the fastest group and not work at all and not pedal is a huge advantage to your race, but not always to your training. So I always want, you will talk about this again today, is separating training from racing, because what you do in your training is to elicit a result in your race. That's not necessarily how you're going to perform your race. So
Yeah, that's a great point. I think with that, we can definitely start maybe the next topic that really highlights the difference between using something when you train versus using something when you want to perform. And I think it's really important to differentiate between the two. In my opinion, a lot of times when you work with competitive cyclists, you want to make sure that their training maybe sometimes overshoots the goal. Like you want it to be simulating what they're going to do and not leave too many stones unturned. You want to be able to really arrive at your event with as little uncertainty as possible. Sometimes you can't do that, especially when it's your first go at something. But physically, I think it is important that people recognize that if you're trying to simulate something by just making it harder, that's not necessarily going to help you on the day of the event. There are so many moving parts that you have to take into account, but I think a lot of times people have this idea that in order to replicate an event, the only piece that they have to really consider is how hard it's going to be.
yeah.
Right. But there are way more stuff they have to consider, and they have to be cautious to not turn their training into the event itself.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we'll touch upon, let's dive into that a little bit. So if you want to introduce us
to
into
the
that
next
topic.
topic. Yeah, so we're gonna hit some clickbait right now, and talk about caffeine. Coffee culture is huge in cycling. We all love grabbing a coffee before our rides, during our rides, after our rides. But how is that affecting our training? How is that affecting our performance? So most of us know that drinking or ingesting caffeine is an ergogenic aid. It can help to increase force, contractile force in the muscle. I don't know the exact process, but it's got something to do with calcium reuptake and keeping calcium inside the muscle, I believe, and increasing the force contraction. Maybe you can expand on that a little bit in a second. But ultimately, what we find is like people are drinking it and using it more and more often, and possibly to a detriment. So I'll share an anecdote about why I want to reconsider whether ingesting caffeine is the best for your training. And again, looking at zone 1 heart rate, and we won't always talk about that. We'll talk about high intensity stuff as well, because maybe caffeine is a booster for that. But when I did my 300-kilometer ride, what I noticed was that morning I made a concerted effort to not drink any coffee that day. I hadn't really had much the day before, and I hadn't brought any caffeinated product with me on the ride. So I usually have about two coffees a day. So it gives you kind of my background, whether I'm riding or not riding. So that day, without any caffeine in there, what I noticed was I was able to tap into more power at my zone 1 heart rate than normal, or at least the same as what I could on a 1-hour ride, but I could extend it across the full 9.5 hours of riding that we did. And that was unusual for me, because usually I see a big drop off after about 2.5 hours in my power at the same heart rate. So my zone 1 heart rate is about 145 beats per minute. After that, I'm no longer being oxidative. So I try to stay under that. But during workouts when I'm trying to stay close to my top of my zone 1 and get a high yield from that, or at least in my head, that's what I'm getting. I noticed that drop off happening even an hour and a half into the ride, and my power has to come down 20 to 30 watts in order to stay in my heart rate zone 1 range. But that day was an exception to the rule, which is funny because it was such a huge day. And the only variable that was different was not having caffeine on the day. Now, whether that's better for my training or not, that's up for debate. But have you got any other experiences or anecdotes or stuff you've seen from your athletes that resemble the thing that I was just mentioning?
Hey, so let me give you my personal experience with caffeine. So I haven't drank coffee until the age of 26 or 7.
Yeah.
So not being exposed to caffeine when I was deep in the world of racing. Let's just put it this way: I wish I had coffee when I was racing.
Right.
Okay, like definitely after I discovered caffeine, I was definitely banging my head against the wall, just like, why didn't I know about this before?
Yeah.
So caffeine is considered as one of the let's say has one of the most significant effects on performance from all ergogenic aids that you can take, okay, that are legal. If I'm not mistaken, in the early, I think 90s, it was considered a banned substance.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, I guess everybody's quoting me on that now, but it's something I can look into and see the history of caffeine in doping. But I do remember something vaguely on that. So yeah, it's a big ergogenic aid. One of the things that it has been linked to in the past, and I have some articles that I'm happy to share, some reviews, some meta-analyses that I've looked at, is really the ability to oxidize fat earlier on during your workout, and essentially that's making you more efficient and really allows you to utilize that substrate from the onset or from the onset of the workout, and allows you to become quote unquote more efficient during your ride. So that's the big advantage for having caffeine for sure. Another one is that it's I think it's been shown to inhibit fatigue, mental fatigue. I guess a lot of us kind of know that, you have caffeine, you can sit in front of your computer and do a bit more work than maybe if you wouldn't have had that cup of coffee. But those factors definitely come into play when it comes to performance.
Mhm.
So the thing about caffeine, even though it is a very powerful ergogenic aid, in training, like you've shown, maybe there are aspects that you want to try and train without the use of caffeine. As far as the reliance on it from a physiological standpoint, I must admit it's not my forte. So I'm not a nutritionist. I don't know. It's not just nutrition actually, but it's I'm not too familiar with the mechanism. So I think it is something to play with, and I think that if you're always relying on high dosage of caffeine before your training, it may actually impair your ability to train your body in a way to become more resilient to fatigue. So essentially, you're giving it some sort of a crutch every time that you're going into a ride, and you're saying, okay, these crutches are going to carry me through, you know, at the earlier parts of my ride. I'm going to feel better. I'm going to ride faster. My heart rate's going to be relative to my power output not so high. But when you're dealing with rides that are, let's say, more extreme, that are way longer, maybe you want to have a reduced amount of caffeine intake because you don't want to have that bump, that spike at the onset of the ride. So that's definitely something to consider. And that's where some self-experimentation really needs to come into play, because you want to see what happens when you ingest caffeine and what amounts of caffeine and even what type of coffee you're drinking, because they're not all similar, and actually they are far from it. They're quite different. So you want to see what works for you and how you can better incorporate it to your workouts. If we want to break it down into kind of a training program, how would you use it? So in my opinion, I think having caffeine before rides that are, or more caffeine before rides that are short and high intensity, that's actually a good thing. So you're preparing yourself for the workload, you're maximizing the efficiency of that ride, you can hit the power output that you want, and you come back home and you feel okay, and then you just start the recovery process. If you have a 3 to 4 hour ride, maybe it's not such a good idea to have a lot of coffee before you start. Maybe just, maybe a coffee that's slightly less strong, not as concentrated. Or if you're taking, caffeine supplements in the form of a pill or something like that, maybe don't take too many. Again, it's all relative, right? So too many for you might be something else on what's on the label. So maybe not taking too much before a long ride is a good idea, kind of mitigating the effects of caffeine at the start of the ride, allowing you to enter it with slightly less stress to the system without really opening up all the taps right from the gun, and eliminating the potential drop that may occur once the caffeine starts to fade, unless the coffee stop is, just down the road in like 2 hours or an hour after you start the ride. So I think that's kind of a way to play around with it a little bit.
We don't stop for coffee till the end of my rides, not midway through. That's
really?
Yeah, I try not to.
Oh.
You earn your coffee on a Paul Moffat ride, that's for sure.
Hey.
This is all just a conspiracy for the caffeine industry, just to get us more caffeinated. No, I guess.
Sure.
But it is interesting, and that's something maybe we can talk about in later weeks is dosage and timing, because nutritionally, if you're taking things like caffeine before your ride will have a certain effect, during your ride will have a certain effect, and now there's also research to show that having caffeine or going for coffee afterwards can boost the adaptation from your training as well. So it's very interesting. And now I don't have any of that research with me, so I'd have to do that first. But we just want to give you guys some food for thought, maybe spur some more topics in the future if you're interested in that.
Yeah, and I'll be curious, actually. Sorry, I'll be curious to see in the comments if people have experienced ingesting caffeine at different times, how it affected them. So if they played around with it, someone took 10 shots of espresso and then went and banged out a time trial, what did that do? There is evidence out there to show that. It's a very hot topic. Caffeine has always been a big topic. So there's a lot of information out there, but it's always interesting for me to listen to anecdotes from different experiences.
And anecdotally, to argue the other side, is I have met clients who feel like they have caffeine sensitivity and it brings on cramping faster than non-caffeinated. So again, individual results may vary. But before we get too far in that, I think everyone should bear in mind that when we're talking about ergogenic aids, you shouldn't focus all your energy on using that to get the most out of yourself. That's kind of like the last step in the process, right? What would be more valuable to your training is like cleaning up your diet in general, or even thinking about like how well hydrated was I the day before, because that can affect your heart rate and therefore your zone 1 training. How well rested are you? How much crap did you eat the night before? Or did you eat like a really good healthy meal, good carbohydrates and low in fiber, which would, for a race, would be really good. And again, racing versus training. How's your diet in general looking? If you can clean up parts of that, you might find that you have a much stronger training effect than trying to cram in a coffee before each ride. So
absolutely,
put into perspective as well. So
yeah, making sure you take care of your foundations is very, very important. Obviously, before you start to add on different things and kind of building your hopes up on each of the supplements you're going to take, or every fancy thing you're going to buy for your bike, or something else. But you touched upon something very interesting, and that's the masking effect that caffeine may have on underlying issues. So cramping, for example, if you have, let's say if you have those issues, if you cramp up after a certain type of ride, it's a very high intensity ride or a race, and you think, wow, maybe it's really the caffeine that I'm ingesting or something like that. Some other thing that you're consuming or not consuming. That's an interesting point, because caffeine is really trying to wake you up, right? It's supposed to wake you up. So if you're already super, super tired in a race situation and you ingest the caffeine and you hope that maybe you'll be able to push more or survive the race, and then you start cramping, it's very hard to decouple that, so you think, wow, I just ingested the caffeine, now I'm cramping, so maybe it's the caffeine and not something else. And that's a really bad type of approach, because cramping, for just as an example, is something that is probably not linked to changes that are induced by caffeine, even though maybe there is something to do with calcium channels, and that may interfere with the ability of the muscle to contract properly. It probably has something more to do with your training. The point where you start to cramp is probably more indicative of just the point of kind of failure, where the muscles just can't produce the amount of work that's required of them in that specific event or training session. So when you go back to your coach, or you kind of tell yourself, wow, I need to stop having caffeine because it just ruins my training every time I take it, and I start to cramp at this point, maybe you want to think, why are you cramping in the first place? Do you really think it's the caffeine, or you think it's something else? Mm-hmm. So caffeine is just analogous to an ergogenic aid that perhaps when used improperly can mentally make you think that you're covering something, that you use it as an excuse for not training enough, or not recovering enough, or not eating well enough. So I think that's one of the bigger issues from the mental side of ergogenic aids in general. I'm not a big proponent of ergogenic aids. I think it's really important for athletes to, like you said, make sure they take care of their fundamentals first, that they do what they need to do properly, and then start to think about the marginal gains that may come from ingesting caffeine and stuff like that. Those things you probably want to save for race day, but you don't want to try them out on race day. You want to try them in the training for sure, just so you know what they're going to feel like before you come to the race. But if you show up to the race and you think caffeine is going to save you if you haven't put in the work, that's misuse of caffeine or an ergogenic aid in general, or any type of aid in general. So that's kind of my take on that.
Absolutely. Well, I think the issue stems from most people thinking that there's a magic pill out there. So you are, say, the rider who cramps pretty regularly in your rides, or actually, serving from memory, most of the people who are complaining about cramping, when they started to do their structured training, and we started to get them working on their nutrition while they rode, because that can be a big one too. Once they started to hit the calorie intake that was relevant to the type of riding they were doing, and training in a nice structured way, they noted that they weren't cramping during their training, but they were cramping while racing. So that could be more an issue of your energy management on the day. You're maybe going out too hard in your race, or getting a little bit too ambitious, maybe riding with a group that was just outside of your own skills to get the fastest time that day. And simply the effort, how you manage your effort, was probably the big issue on the day, not the fact that you had caffeine or things like that. But the other issue is, there's a lot of media outlets out there, and they make money from clickbait and things like that. So how many times a week do you see the 5 best things for cyclists ergogenic aids, and like the 10 things you're doing wrong, right? And often they will have evidence to support their claims, but there's no kind of real big perspective. And that's catering to most people's desire to find that magic pill that's gonna fix their problems for them in an instant, right? Just this one thing. But like you said, you got to put in the work realistically. You got to figure out, what are the other elements? What have I fixed or worked on all of my foundations first? And then the ergogenic aid is just going to give you an extra boost. It's not there to fix all your problems. It's there to give you that race winning performance, the difference between third place and first place. It's not going to change 40 minutes of your fondo time if you haven't done the training and you're not eating well enough. Fix that first, right?
Yeah, there's a researcher called Louis Passfield. He's from the University of Kent.
Yeah.
And he is a very known figure in the world of cycling as a researcher. And he has an excellent presentation that I think kind of breaks down different correlations that are trying to map out what are the important things that we need to work on that characterize a good cyclist from someone who's not as good. And I'll try to find that talk and link it in our comments. I think what it's coming to show is that really the foundations are the most important piece of the puzzle. You can't ignore them, and you can't just mask them by using shortcuts or trying to really put your hopes up on something that's very, very specific and perhaps is a very small contribution to your overall performance. I think that I give me a second. I kind of lost my train of thought there, but well, never mind. I'll get back to it. But anyway, the whole point, I think yes, I remember so with regards to cramping, again, what we are currently seeing is that cramping is something that's probably more related to just muscular fatigue. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have something to do with, you want to talk about marketing magnesium, for example.
Yeah.
Man, there was a time in the early 2000s that magnesium was the miracle cure for all cramping.
I'm just going to
And
stop you there and say that I've been guilty of falling into
yeah, yeah.
knowingly, knowing that it was, well, I'll let you finish off your thing, but the placebo effect is strong.
Oh,
So
it's very
yeah,
strong.
keep,
And I don't underestimate the placebo effect at all, actually. I think, if people think they're faster and because of that they are faster, okay, that's as far as performance goes, I'll take that.
yeah.
You just have to be aware of the risks,
Mm-hmm.
okay? Um, I think, it's funny because in the past when I was racing in places like Belgium and the Netherlands, and you had mixed groups. So I was this young kid, and I was standing next to someone who was, I don't know, in his late 40s, 50s, and he just drank like 10 shots of espresso. He would shake like crazy, like mad, at the start line, right? And you got to think like, how healthy is that, right? So it's
Yeah,
not.
yeah,
I mean, the guy is like, close to 50, and he's banging away at 10 shots of espresso before a race. I don't know what's more risky, the race itself or the caffeine. But again, you gotta have to kind of be cautious with what you're doing to your body and the experimentations you're doing, and really playing around with those ergogenic aids too far to one extreme. So the takeaway message really is take care of your fundamentals. Ergogenic aids are important. There's no question about that. But you want to be maybe more, you want to tailor them to your needs. You want to tailor them in your program. You don't want every time you go on a 1 hour easy ride to have 10 shots of espresso.
yeah,
Obviously I'm exaggerating, but it's just to make the point that we have to be careful with the stuff that we put in our system in the hopes that that's what's going to make us faster. If I go on a 1 hour ride and I don't drink coffee, not before and not after, I'll be fine. And maybe even better than having that 2 or 3 shots of espresso beforehand, because maybe the workout itself is intended to reduce stress in the system. And now when you drank all that coffee, you didn't really help too much with that. So that's the point. You want to be able to just look at what is important from the offset. What are the fundamentals? Am I eating right, sleeping right, training as I need to? That will also eliminate the excuses,
yeah,
a lot of them. And then on top of that, you want to really try to see what works for you. How much should I take from one thing? What does it do when I take it? I went on this ride. I had this much to drink. Drink mixes is another big thing, right? Every single thing that you consider buying or adding to your training is, you have to take it with a grain of salt. There
yeah,
is no magic pill. It's all about self experimentation, looking through the science, and hopefully listening to podcasts like this that are giving you the warnings in advance, and maybe not completely eliminating taking a substance or not, but just acting with more caution when you're trying or considering taking those supplements. So I'm not saying don't take it.
yeah,
I'm just saying take it easy.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Always try it in your training, not on race day with no
No.
prior experience. The cramping topic is one that we could spend all day on, but I want to touch in on that just a little bit, seeing as we naturally segued into it. So, like when I was going through university, we were trying to look at ways of preventing cramping and ways of disproving anti-cramping methods. So initially, we listed out like a number of reasons why you might possibly cramp, and then work backwards why they probably won't. So hydration was one, electrolyte balance, carbohydrate ingestion, et cetera, et cetera. And what I guess what they found was, even if you nailed those targets, you got your hydration correct for how much you're sweating that day, you got your electrolyte balance in through your mix, so you're replacing it as you're sweating, and you're hitting a basic number of carbohydrates per hour. The problem with all of those are all methods that work through the entire body, yet cramping happens so locally that you're kind of like, it's kind of like throwing all the darts at the dartboard, hoping to hit the bullseye. And it did work for some people anecdotally, and it didn't work for lots of others who were cramping. And then in the last few years, I was reading some research saying that for most athletic types of cramping, it becomes a mismatch between uh, neural input into the muscles itself. So once you start to get fatigue, the electrical signals or your nerve endings are getting overly stimulated, and they're firing off that muscle and not allowing it to relax and decrease its tone as it normally would. And that's where I guess the pickled juice and eating chilies during the ride or pre-ride and post-ride and all this other jazz came into it. Was using these aids again to change the neural input into the muscle. Something about chili gives like a whole, and again, that's the problem, is it's a whole body reaction to hopefully reset the nerves at the site of the muscle, and with varying success. And when that happened and they found that, suddenly you just started seeing all these products turn up, like chili shots and pickle gels and all this jazz. But then I haven't heard any more research since then, or I haven't actively been digging for it, but I haven't seen anything on media outlets or anything more to do with that. So it's kind of just funny how things just work in that direction. We still don't know what's causing cramping.
Yeah, and that's no fault of that's just how science works. So I think it's, again, just because something comes out and it says that it's the next best thing, you got to, again, take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
And wait a few months and years and you'll find another article that says that's not the case. Yeah. But I think if we want to discuss a little bit about cramping, and I think it is a very important topic, and maybe we can dedicate an episode to it. I'll just quickly throw out my approach when somebody is having issues with cramping. So understanding that even if there is some sort of a neurochemical issue, it's not really something that I can measure. As a coach, I'm very limited in that respect. So I'm trying to use the tools that I have. So if I know, or if I assume that fatigue is a main factor in the way that the muscle contracts, what can I do to reduce that fatigue in the first place? So training is obviously one aspect. Okay, so if the training isn't tailored to the individual correctly, meaning that they train too hard, fatigue is something that, or they don't recover enough, then fatigue is something that's going to accumulate quite a bit. And then it doesn't have to be from day to day. It can be accumulative over a longer period of time. But then at some point, repetitive instances of cramping will start to come on. Okay, so that's maybe one thing. So you want to basically account for what the person can actually do and then tailor the workouts properly and make sure they don't over fatigue the system and don't get into overuse or overtraining. So that's one aspect. The other thing can be how they sit on the bike. Okay, so by sitting on the bike in a fit that isn't good for that individual, that means that maybe they're using one muscle around a specific joint more than they should. Okay, so for example, if you're sitting on a road bike and you tend to sit slightly further forward on the saddle, you'll naturally engage your quad muscles, especially the front of the thigh. The front of the thigh, the quad muscles, more than you normally would if you were sitting maybe closer to the center or further back beyond the center of, let's say, the bottom bracket. Okay, as a reference point. And maybe we'll get some bike fitters in the comments that maybe will give me some better direction there. But essentially, that's what should occur. If that is the case, and you go on a ride that's 3 hours long, sitting in that position, you're really overworking your quad muscles, and you're not utilizing the glutes and the hamstring as much as maybe you should. And then a race situation, even that becomes even worse. So then all of a sudden, you're in a position that's putting a lot of force through your quads and they're overworked, and then you start to cramp, right? So fixing something like a position, just doing a bike fit with a good bike fitter, that can sometimes resolve cramping. And I've seen it many times in the past. Personally, I've had that issue as well. So it's really trying to eliminate the fatigue factor. And fatigue can be local, and it can be whole body, like it is in training. And it could be something that's beyond the training, like stress, high stress levels, right? It could be that your diet is improper and it's not giving you what you need to actually not reach the same level of fatigue during a workout. So the more you can do, I mean, people say, you know, the banana is great because it has whatever you need in terms of reducing cramping, but maybe it's just the fact that all of a sudden you're eating.
Yeah.
You know, maybe that's it. So it's not about what you eat, it's the fact you're eating in the first place.
Yeah.
So those are all, that's kind of the way that I treat that type of a problem. It's a little bit like dealing with an injury. You want to, as much as you can, try to find the source.
Yeah.
But until you do, you want to really try and manipulate some aspects that you can, that kind of make more sense, that may have an impact on the outcome.
I think nutrition is a huge one, even though it's not necessarily explaining localized cramping or localized fatigue. Even my amateur athletes who don't have very ambitious goals, they just want to be stronger cyclists, one of the first things get them to look at is their carbohydrate ingestion during the ride. I'm not there to give them nutritional advice. So it's not really my forte, and I try and outsource that, but I can help them on the bike nutrition. And we just figure out, what are you eating on your rides? How much carbohydrates does all that have? And what's your nutritional timing like? Are you waiting until you're tired to do that, et cetera, et cetera? So we get right down to like, how many carbohydrates per hour are you taking on? And can we improve that? Because we know that there's actually, you can get up to about 90 grams of carbohydrate absorption for most athletes if you're having a 2-to-1 glucose fructose ratio. Now, you know, for anyone listening out there, you don't need to sit there and now try and figure out how much glucose and fructose is in your stuff. But generally speaking, like if you're having a Lara bar and it's got some dates and stuff in it, you're going to get fructose that way. A lot of drink mixes have a mixture of both already in it. Like I use Born. I keep mentioning them. This isn't a plug. I'm not getting paid by them, but I use them because they already have a 2-to-1 ratio in their drink mix. So I know I'm going to get that. Either way, we try and figure out what their carbohydrate ratio is per hour and see if we can improve that a little bit. So if you're someone who doesn't like to eat very much and you're only getting 30 grams of carbohydrates in there, if I can lift that up to 50, that's going to make a difference right away. And from my experience, people who cramp, when we start to work this direction and make sure that they're eating on almost a timed basis, they tend to either prolong the time to cramping, which is good, or eliminate cramping altogether, at least on training rides. And then we only see it on events, which probably indicates us more about riding outside of their natural abilities.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really working up towards that intensity when you reach those events, you know. So even if you're able to improve your cramping issues in a workout, that still doesn't mean that they won't come back in a race situation. The amount of demand you're putting through the system in a race situation is far greater, even as far as the stress levels that you have. That already elevates the response of the system quite a bit, and it's quite taxing. So therefore, you shouldn't expect that if you solve the cramping on a training ride, that it's going to get resolved in the race. That for that to happen, you just have to train at that intensity and maybe race more often. You know, that's the other aspect that you need to consider.
Just as an anecdote, every year that I've done the Whistler Fondo and I ride that ride as hard as I can, I always try to be in the front group. I pretty much cramp every time I cross the finish line because I put everything in there. And those groups are maybe a little bit outside of what I can do, at least the top 10 riders, but trying to stick with them just brings me to my absolute performance bottom.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
know that's going to happen, and I'm subject to that. And to other athletes, they keep saying, oh, I'm getting better in my training. I'm not getting my cramping there anymore, but I keep cramping in my event. So just go back and ask them, okay, well, A, how much faster did you ride this year than the last year? Oh, it's 20 minutes faster. Okay, well, that was your overall goal. So even though you cramped, you still achieved your goal. So pat yourself on the back. So the training is obviously working and your strategy is obviously working. But did you go as hard that year as you went the previous year? Oh, yeah, I went as hard as I could go. Okay, well, there you go. Like, you're still trying to elicit a different result by doing exactly the same thing. So
Yeah.
energy
I,
management to me in that scenario. So you
I,
didn't race the race any differently. So why were you expecting a different outcome?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if I would use the did I cramp or did I not cramp as a measure of how hard I went. It's a little bit
No,
like when we used to do the HIIT sessions, the high intensity interval training sessions in the park. And if we wouldn't leave until someone would lose their breakfast, right? So, but maybe that's just an extreme version of my workouts. I'm joking. Not really, but kind of. Anyway,
it's not a
so
joke for everyone who's out there. If you haven't experienced an ASAF HIIT session, maybe we can leave them with a little tidbit workout to try out.
oh yeah, for
It's
sure.
one you won't soon forget. And remember, you're probably going to require a lot of recovery afterwards. So give
Yeah.
yourself, maybe do it early on in the week and then take a few days of off your bike time.
Oh, I think we just lost half the audience right now. Yeah, just right there. Yeah, I think definitely I mean, the way that you want to, cramping is really, I have another example actually from an athlete that suffered from chronic cramping. So they really had issues with that no matter what type of training we did and no matter what type of racing they were in, they always cramped. Whether it was a hot day, a cold day, they always cramped. Now, they had an issue where they had an imbalance between right and left. Okay, from injuries and stuff like that. Not a young individual. I would say like mid. So not a young rider, like not 20s. It was like 40, mid 40s, and or it carried quite a few injuries, and that imbalance may have caused again one side to fatigue more than the other. So again, this fatigue aspect is something that you need to address that's specific for you. So if you know that you have an issue on one side of your body, maybe spend more time trying to strengthen that part. Even if you do it on the fly, you just add specific strength and conditioning workouts and different type of workouts that are more specific to your problem, to your imbalance. That can definitely help as well. And the last thing I would say is don't ignore cramping. Okay, cramping is a sign that something is working too hard, in my opinion. My experience with cramping, I can give you an example. I have multiple, but I can give you one example. I was in a race and I was in a breakaway with a significant gap with two other riders. So a podium finish for sure. And I felt really good that day. I was driving that breakaway and I thought, wow, if we make it to the finish, I'm just going to ditch these guys and that's it. But it was during a time where I did suffer from cramping quite a bit, even though I put in a lot of training miles and it was in the start of the season and I felt really, really good. And I started cramping during that break and I didn't want to quit. I didn't want to stop. So I just kept going, kept on pounding lap after lap. And I think it was just with a few laps remaining, no matter what I ate and what I drank, they didn't go away. And then at some point, both my legs just locked up. They just completely locked up. I couldn't pedal and just unclipped and had to, somebody grabbed me and I sat down. And after quite some time sitting there, I somehow wobbled back to the start finish area. And the next day I was in real pain, like real pain. And it was coming from my, which one was it? I think it was vastus medialis or something like that, one of the quad muscles. And I went to the doctor after, the pain just didn't go away. And he said, listen, you actually caused serious damage to both your legs, like significant damage. And that took me off the bike for quite some time. So it's obviously something you want to take care of before you cause serious damage. But if you start noticing those things come on, whether it's in an event or during a specific ride that you do, first of all, try to look at the elements. What led to that event? What led to that cramping issue? And then talk to your coach, look at your bike, look at your training, look at your recovery, and really try to work it out, because it really doesn't work. It's not worth not the pain and not the time away from your bike.
Yeah, definitely. Totally agree. Just having some perspective about whether it's in your best interest or not. Going against that though, just anecdotally, when you're in the middle of the race, and I've been there too, you're pretty unlikely to give up at that point. You're so invested in your breakaway or whatever, and the result that for most of us in that situation would probably keep charging on through the cramping. But what I've found personally is if you change the input, you can help stave off the cramps fairly well. So playing around with like different cadences. So for example, I was doing a triple crown once, and it's just a big day, and I didn't know how to manage my energy properly then. So I went way too hard on Seymour, felt great on grouse. By the time I'm getting up Cypress, 10 minutes in, and I was starting to cramp. So I played around with different cadences, and I found that changing the cadence, I could shift where the responsibilities were going through my legs. So if I was cramping through my hamstrings, I could shift the weight into my quads and really feel that. And that's when I started to realize that in spite of what the research says about cadence can actually really change where the force is being derived from. So I could stave off the cramps from my hamstrings just by changing that and changing the tension in the drivetrain. So sometimes it meant lighter tension and sometimes it meant heavier tension. It just depends where you're getting that cramp from. So
yeah. I agree. I don't know if I haven't looked at it enough to see if the research actually does or doesn't back it up. But in my opinion, that makes a lot of sense. And even from some of the data that we have, it's maybe not so much as far as the cadence itself, but really the way that you pedal. So,
I mean,
like you said,
pedal stroke is such a cool topic. I think we could probably touch on that in an entire episode as well. And just a quick little tidbit from some of my athletes who have knee pain and things like that. I tend to find if it's a newer athlete, there tends to be a consistent trend. They're experiencing knee pain and things like that. They tend to be grinders. They use heavy gears and they pedal really slow. And if you look at their pedal stroke, they tend to push and just hammer down. So they're really isolating their quad by using that technique. And if you get them to, and it doesn't mean that we can't use slow cadence technique. In fact, they use slow cadence technique to help this. So if you're listening in, try this out and go and find somewhere flat initially and pedal at say 50 to 60 RPM. But by pedaling that slowly, keep your effort really, really low. We're not looking for high power. You're not doing like a threshold effort or anything like that. But try to use that slow down pedal stroke to now feel the pulling stroke and sense other muscles. If you start to figure out where the sensations are going, you're going to be able to turn your hamstrings on, get some glutes in there, shift your body weight around until you start to feel the pressure easing up through your quads, right? Another place you can feel it often is like in your feet. If you're feeling like your toes are getting crushed and then getting numb during your riding, you're probably pushing really hard. So just by scraping and lifting, you're literally taking the pressure off the sole of your shoes, right? So you can change where the force is being directed. Even though I know the research says, and this is the issue, is like GCN does science, and they were talking about pedal stroke and that the top athletes all tend to have a dominant pushing phase. They don't have a circular pedal stroke. So yeah, to credit the research, it is evident that there seems to be a correlation between a pushing stroke and higher power output. However, we're not necessarily talking about an elite group of cyclists, and you have to understand, if you're listening to this, that those cyclists have probably spent years and years working on their pedal stroke. So their pedal stroke overall is pretty good. They're just a little bit more predominant in the pushing phase. So there's still value to working on your pedal stroke and thinking about that rather than just thinking about the power that you're putting out. Yeah.
Yeah, I think definitely it's again, it's not so much about the rev, how many revolutions per minute you're doing, but it's really how you're doing it and where you're putting the power. And going back to the workout that you showed in the beginning, where you did the low cadence, I think it was low cadence, low power sessions. So that's really important as well, especially in your, if anybody wants a tip on how to make their zone 1 training more interesting, that's one of the ways to do it. Use cadence. I think I remember I had a rider who was training for Haute Route Pyrenees or something like that. And they did all the training and everything was fine. But one thing we didn't account for is the steepness of the climbs in the Pyrenees is extreme compared to what we have here. So even though they had the volume and they had the power, they weren't used to pedaling, grinding a gear up that climb. And the gearing that they had didn't allow them to pedal more than 60 or 70 RPMs for a long period of time. And that load on the system creates a lot of pressure. And all of a sudden, everything starts to change. Even metabolically, things start to change. So fatigue definitely can come into play, and it can come into play at an exponential rate because all of a sudden the system is just like, what is going on? Like, just pedal, man. So it's really something that you want to consider working on throughout your training. Just changing the rev range, working on low cadence and high cadence, because you are gonna encounter situations where you'll have to put power down at a cadence that isn't what you're used to.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's important is like, don't be a one-trick pony, right? Like, practice high cadence and practice low cadence. There isn't one best fit. Like, if you're talking about crit racing or being on the track, being able to snap up into 110 RPM, you want to accelerate away from somebody. See if you can go from 90 to 110 RPM or higher in the shortest amount of time as possible. You'll get that acceleration is huge. It's not always about eliciting high power, although realistically, power is just a derivative of the tension and the speed of your feet. So speeding up your feet equals more power.
Yeah, you can change the gear,
huge.
but yeah.
But then to show the other side of the equation, I'll share a story from a fun gravel ride that I did with Dylan Davies. Credit to Dylan. He's been a huge influence in my cycling career. And I'll talk about that another day. But we did a fun ride in Ucluelet, and we went up Mount Ozard. And I just had my gravel rig put together, and I had a 44 chain ring on the front, 42 on the back. And I was like, this will be enough to get me up anything. It's almost 1-to-1 ratio. But the Mount Ozard was like pretty steep, and it's got that kind of like shoaly gravel where you don't get a lot of traction if you're standing because of the steepness and the surface. So you have to be seated. And even though I was fresh and I could put out about 360 watts for 40 minutes at that point, I couldn't get over 320-ish watts because I had to be seated, pedaling super slow. And what was happening is, because I hadn't had that in my training repertoire, and I'm talking like cadences of like 40 to 50, I didn't have that in my training repertoire. And I was rocking my hips so much to derive the power that I needed to just go up. It wasn't any egotistical thing. It was just to keep moving. But because of the rocking nature of my hips, and this is where I can share my expertise, I didn't have the stability in my lower back muscles to support that much tension at that point. So I had been training steeper hill climbs, or well, not steeper, steep-ish on the road bike, where I could keep my pedal rate up above 80 easily and be seated. So my
And
hips were,
traction. Yeah.
yeah, my hips were locked. I had perfect traction and no worries. Soon as the cadence range changed, I had to try find someone else to derive power. So rocking my hips like this, my lower back got so fatigued. That was the limiter. My legs could still put out 360, but my back couldn't handle the amount of force I was trying to, it couldn't stabilize my hips any longer to get that power out. And that's
Yeah.
when I realized I needed to do some low cadence drills, even if it was at lighter power, and just learn how to keep my hips still. So another thing is, if you're a rider and you shift your weight a lot, like try to play around with keeping nice and still, and creating a nice firm base of support. Work your core, get your glutes firing. Try to pedal without your hips rocking. So again, bike fit is going to be important for that as well. If your seat's too high, your hips are going to pitch. And then work on that low cadence, and make that part of your toolbox, low
Yeah.
and high cadence.
I'll add one more thing to that. And this past year and a half, roughly year and a half, 2 years, I've been riding on gravel, right? So up to that point, I was riding only on the road. And I have to say, even from personal experience and incorporating mountain biking or gravel riding in my athletes' training rides, those that have that, that made a huge difference. In my opinion, yeah, for sure. And maybe the science can back it up. That's where the mountain bikers compared to roadies have the upper hand. The dynamic range they have to work at as far as their cadence is much wider, and it happens more regularly. So the terrain really requires them to go from high cadence to low cadence very quickly, and maintaining either the same amount of power or even higher power outputs at either of those extremes of the rev range. And they're much more explosive that way, and they're working at a very high demand. It's extremely difficult. The stress is super high, heart rate's always high, focus is very high. So they have to be able to work at a much higher rev range on demand. So if you're a roadie, maybe considering cross training in the field, in the mountains, on a mountain bike or a gravel bike, in my opinion, is a big help. And if you don't want to just use the road bike at different terrains and you have access to gravel with a gravel bike or a mountain bike, go do it. That's just a much more, in my opinion, a more fun way to get that type of training, get that mix in, and just work on those stabilizing muscles in just a more fun and efficient way. So
Yeah, you're also going to end up improving your bike handling and your confidence. And there's a ton of great things you can get from mountain biking or gravel riding. Maybe mountain biking might be a bit ambitious for some athletes, but grab a gravel bike and try some trails. Don't just do flat dike riding, because that's not going to improve a whole lot of stuff. But there's some pretty steep climbs if you're going from Locarno up towards 4th Avenue, where they're pretty demanding, and you'll have to try different cadence ranges, and you need core stability as well. Some of the descents back down through there, if you're using the most eastern part of that part of Pacific Spirit Park down to Northwest Marine Drive, there's actually pseudo mountain biking. Mountain bike guys are going to tear me to pieces for this. It's not mountain bike at all. But on a gravel bike, you got some ruts and some roots and some rocks and stuff. You'll have to work at core stability and get confident maneuvering around those things. So there's a lot that can happen. That can be one ride a week. It's not going to interfere with your training. It's also good just to do fun stuff. Don't always make a structured training. Keep that. We talked about that last week. Is like, keep the passion in there. Do stuff that's fun. Like, use your bike as an opportunity to explore different places and have different experiences.
yeah,
So cool.
and I don't think it takes away from your training at all. I think, like I said, if you go and you do a zone 1 ride, but you just do it on a mountain bike, maybe it will be a very slow ride, but it will work on things that you can't work on the road bike. And those do carry over quite a bit. So there are ways to mix it up, keep it fun, and still get big gains for your workouts, even if you're not on the machine that you're planning to spend your time in an event on. So yeah, we can definitely dive into cross training and working towards a specific event using maybe multiple bikes for those that have it. But I think that's a topic for a different
Yeah,
episode.
I think we'll slowly wrap up here. Two more things. Asaf, do you want to give a sample of your HIIT workout? Explain what that is. Give people a chance to try that out.
Absolutely. So a HIIT session, the way that I design it is essentially having very short segments of about, first of all, do a really good warm-up and don't eat too much before you do it. So yeah, if it's a very nice breakfast, save it for another day. So anyway, the workout is designed in a way that it's going to really stress your system and not allow you enough time to recover between the efforts. So my kind of classical design of that workout is you select a hill that's approximately 40 seconds to a minute long, max. And then the recovery back down needs to be about if it's a 45-second effort, you want the recovery to be around 215 to 230, okay? And that's really not enough time to recover. If you go full gas for 45 seconds up that climb and you only have 2 minutes 15 or 2:30 to recover, you're not going to recover. And that's the point of the workout. Now, there's two ways you can do it. You can either do as many of those as you can with trying to reach the same peak power output. So you want to really go as hard as you can. If you start to slow down or you don't reach the 45-second distance that you usually cover, you start to finish the 45 seconds lower down and stuff like that. You're starting to the benefits are it's not really the same type of workout now. So you want to be able to hit the same finish line every 45 seconds or pass it. Okay, and then 215 down, and during those 215 you need to coast, okay, not pedal. You want to just really cruise down, very easy pace. It's gonna feel horrible, okay? Your body actually prefers to keep on pedaling. It prefers to keep the intensity up a little bit to mitigate that gap between going so hard and stopping. So it can be worse. You can actually stop altogether, and that's really bad. Don't do that. But you're coasting back down, you hit it again. The other way you can do it is you want to reach the same effort level each time. So not necessarily covering the same distance in 45 seconds, but just trying to go as hard as you can each time you go up the climb. It's a different workout, but it's also very, very beneficial. Doing it during the week, make sure you're well rested. Make sure you don't have anything hard the next day. And if you do it, I would highly recommend that if you do it in a block, maybe 3 weeks at a time with a week recovery, and don't do it more than a month plus maybe a couple of weeks on either end. Like if you start doing these things every single week, they're really gonna fry the system. So just be careful with that. But they are the outcomes that I've seen from people that have used those workouts are really good. And actually, a recent study that came out, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm sure my colleagues are probably going to correct me if I'm wrong here, that a HIIT session is something that we see that affects mostly men, or better in men. Whereas women, there's a different type of workout that is beneficial for them. But both workouts will provide benefits this workout will provide benefits to both sexes, no question. But it appears as though women tend to respond better to a different type of workout. And I'll bring that workout with me for the next episode so that they can use that as well. So they apply to both, but just don't know that caveat.
Nice. Awesome. Okay, so let's wrap that up there and leave you guys wanting more. Hopefully, thanks, Asaf. It's always fun and great chatting with you. If you guys have any burning questions, leave them in the comments. We will use those for future shows. Some of the stuff we talked about today was from people reaching out to us, so we are listening. And yeah, we hope to talk to you guys again soon. See
Great.
you for now,
Thank
and
you,
catch
Paul.
you Thursday. Bye.